RugbyRenegade.com, the #1 online strength and conditioning program for rugby. Are you ready to get bigger, stronger, fitter, and faster and dominate your opposition? Welcome to the Rugby Renegade podcast, where we build machines.
Hello and welcome to episode 19 of the Rugby Renegade podcast. My name's Jamie Bain and today I interview Nick Grantham, strength and conditioning and sports science consultant. Now Nick is a wealth of information when it comes to S&C. He's worked through the EIS as a sports physiologist and sports scientist, progressing into strength and conditioning, working with various Olympic teams and sports, and now he consults with football teams, most notably West Bromwich Albion he works with at the moment. So loads of good information. He's been doing it for years and he's got a really good way of getting it across. So give it a listen and let us know what you think. Hi Nick, welcome to the Rugby Renegade podcast. Great to have you on. Why don't we start by just getting a little bit of background about yourself. Why don't you tell us how you got into strength and conditioning and some of the teams and sports you've worked with?
Sure. Well, thanks for inviting me on firstly, Jamie, and it's good to catch up after almost 9 years from that very first workshop that I ran with Eric Cressy back in sort of 2007. How did I get into S&C? Well, I left school very early, left at 16, went to work in a bank and an insurance company, realised after 6 years that I was horrendous at that, didn't like the 9 to 5, wearing a suit. So I went back to university, went back to night school, studied at night school, got enough qualifications to get to university, went and studied sports science. And at the time, back in sort of late 90s, strength and conditioning didn't even really exist in the UK. It was really sports science physiologists were the only people really getting jobs out there. So I started off as a sports scientist working with British Gymnastics as a physiologist. And whilst it was interesting, I quickly realised, sort of taking blood lactates and measuring VO2 maxes was relatively dull. What I was interested in was, someone comes in and gets tested, they go away for 6 weeks, they then come back in fitter and stronger and faster. I wanted to know what happened in the middle, what took place in those 6 weeks. So, fortunately, at that point in time, going into sort of 99, 2000, the NSCA ran their first ever certification program up in Leeds, so I went and sat on that and passed my NSCA certification. And again, probably unfortunately for the gymnast, one of the gymnasts got injured, wanted some strength work, so I sort of put my hand up, and we had a successful period of time working with him, and gradually ended up with the rest of the squad coming on board, and that was it then. That really ignited my passion for becoming an S&C coach. I moved from the institute across to the England netball team, and that was my first job as a fully fledged strength and conditioning coach. It was one of, I think, only a couple of positions in the UK that were actually called that. My boss at the time, John Brewer, told me it was career suicide because physiology and sports science was the king at that point, and no one really knew what S&C was, let alone going to work for a sport like netball. The perception of which wasn't that high. However, it's probably one of the best sports I've worked with, one of the best performance directors I've ever worked with in coaches. So I was very lucky that I was able to cut my teeth with a national squad on the ground, and I guess the squad grew in their knowledge of physical preparation as I developed as well. So I think I was very lucky on reflection in the era that I got into S&C. I then transitioned across to the English Institute of Sport. When that started, I think I was number 5 S&C coach into the mix, and loved my time there in the West Midlands, heading up the S&C department. Worked with a wide range of athletes from, your Olympians, Paralympians. It was again, that was a real sort of opportunity for me to learn about really hands-on delivery across such a wide variety of sports. And then in 2007, I left and moved up to the northeast and set myself up as an independent consultant. And ever since then, I've been working and consulting for a range of pro teams in the performing arts. And most recently, I've just taken on a new job working in action sports. So that's going to be quite interesting for me, and it's something new. So yeah, fairly eclectic. I feel old when I talk through that sort of stuff because yeah, it's almost 20 years working as an S&C coach, which is great.
Yeah, definitely, and a wealth of experience. And when we get a guest on, we kind of want to have an insight into their kind of strength and conditioning philosophy, and that's obviously something we could probably talk about for hours. But how would you kind of describe your strength and conditioning philosophy in a nutshell?
So, if we're going to boil it down to one simple thing, it would be whenever I approach a sport, whenever I'm working with a team or an athlete, it's trying to find the one simple thing that isn't being done that will have the biggest impact, and then we do that. Rather than all this BS around marginal gains and trying to be too fancy, most of the sports and most of the athletes that you work with, there's often a fundamental thing that isn't being done, usually because it's perceived to be too simple. So that would be kind of how I approach most sports. And then if we were to break that down into, I've got sort of 5 key areas that I look for when I'm writing programs and when I'm working with people. It's kind of like Ron Seal, does what it says on the tin. So if athletes wanted to work with me, I'm going to be looking for quality of movement before quantity. Doesn't mean that everything has to be super perfect. We've got a bandwidth of movement dysfunction, as long as it's not dangerous. But I want good quality movements. I want it to be functional. That doesn't mean standing on stability balls and wobbling around and doing pseudo sports related. It just means a functional activity that, again, will give me the performance advantage that I'm looking for and the performance gain that I'm looking for. So a functional activity for hypertrophy could be an isolation exercise like a leg curl, leg extension. Okay, but it could also be something that is very sport specific. It depends on where we're at with that athlete development. So quality, functional. I look for everything I like to be as efficient as possible. I don't really understand why people wear a badge of honour about being in the gym for ages and ages and training and trying to get results by volume. So I really try and hone in on, look, if we can do this in 20 minutes and it's taking someone else 40, let's do it in 20. What's the point in just grinding out sessions? I like continuity. One thing I've seen over the years, and particularly with the onset of sort of millennials coming through academies and into training, and also with the rise of the internet guru and expert on Instagram and various platforms, is people are always looking for the new shiny thing and are very easily distracted. So I try and still try and work on continuity of effort, and have found that it's no surprise if you do things repeatedly and do them repeatedly well, you're going to get results. If you constantly flip from one training strategy to another, you'll never really get those adaptations that you're looking for. And then finally, an area that I've always been really strong on and really interested in is recovery and regeneration. I think sometimes we've overdone that a little bit. We've wrapped people up in cotton wool, and I think we're probably realising now that actually sometimes you do need a training stimulus, and you don't need to shut people down every week. So they're kind of my 5 cornerstones, I guess, to the programs I write.
Yeah, that's great, and I'm glad you touched on recovery, because that's something I was going to ask you, because I'm aware that you've spoken about that before.
Yeah.
And as you said, it's kind of often misunderstood by athletes and coaches. So how do you approach recovery with your athletes?
So usually, again, the starting point is the basics. So I talk about a recovery cycle, and that's 3 elements, and it's nutrition, it's body management, and sleep. Because if you've not got those fundamentally in place, jumping into compression skins, slipping into an ice bath, using Omega Wave or whatever diagnostics you want, it is going to be an exercise in futility. Again, we're always looking for bright, shiny stuff. We need to focus on the simple things, getting good quality and quantity of sleep, making sure that we're hydrating and fueling effectively for the training that we're putting our bodies through, and then body management, our passive and active recovery strategies in and around what we're doing. So those would be the recovery cycle is where I start. Then if we want to get into it a little bit more, my colleague and I, Mark Jarvis, developed a recovery pyramid back in about 2005 now to try and make sense of all the recovery strategies that are available, and we sort of put them in a pyramid of increasing sophistication. And what you found was that as you went up in the level of sophistication, actually the research and backing for them is usually less and less. But that's the stuff that everyone wants to do because it's cool and sexy. But what I would do is I'd sit down with an athlete and a coach and look at that. And again, if the fundamentals are in place, then we can start looking at some of the add-ons. And occasionally, even if the fundamentals aren't nailed down, there may be specific situations, maybe going into a competition period or a major tournament, where despite nutrition not being on point or sleep not being on point, we still go and hit them with some of the more sophisticated strategies like cryotherapy or compression garments or nutritional supplementation.
Yeah, that and obviously ties into what you were saying before, and you mentioned marginal gains, where people look at those, the shiny objects as what's really going to make a difference. But if you haven't got those bread and butter things, right first, it's going to have very little effect.
And you see it with recreational athletes, you see it with recreational sort of gym goers that have, not only are they holding down a job and a family, and they're also playing recreational, weekend rugby. And they're trying to do all of these things, and they're running on empty because they're not eating well or not sleeping right, or they're not just taking time out to be with the family and go for a walk down the beach or something just to recharge the batteries. What they're looking for is the latest protein, carbohydrate mix that they're going to chug down after training. They're walking around in skins constantly, even though they've not got the body to do it. Usually, people want the quick fix. And it's rarely a long-lasting fix that you get. I think it's more about habit forming, and again, that links back to continuity of what you're doing. Simple stuff done well.
Yeah, exactly right. Now, moving on. Obviously, you've worked with a lot of team sports, and one of the challenges, and especially in rugby, is being able to peak, every weekend of the season. Now, how would you approach that? Do you think it's possible to sort of periodise things in season? Are you one of these people who thinks it's you're on a kind of maintenance phase throughout the season?
Yeah, it is tough. I mean, I consult in pro football, in the EPL, and yeah, we face similar sorts of issues of trying to be up for every weekend. Obviously, the physical requirements are very different, but nonetheless, you are still trying to peak and taper. I think traditional periodisation models don't necessarily lend themselves to modern team sports and to the modern periodisation. Here we go. It's been a long day. It doesn't really lend itself to the modern sort of training year where the competitive cycle is no longer, one or two peaks a year. It's constant. And even in the off season, they're away on tours and national duty. So I think, traditional models have limited application. I think John Kiley has written a really good. He's a UK strength and conditioning coach. He's written a really good couple of articles looking at a more modern take on periodisation. And actually, if you go back to the work of Mel Siff, who's kind of a legendary S&C coach, he first talks about it in his book Super Training about cybernetic periodisation, which sounds dead funky and dead clever, but basically it's essentially coach what you see in front of you. And I think the modern strength and conditioning professional coming out of university has got very good at programming off of spreadsheets and training apps. What they've lost is the interaction and the art of coaching and the experience of looking at your squad and a player looking you in the eyes and saying, do you know what, I'm absolutely shattered. And for the coach to be comfortable enough to say, well, actually, even though it says on the plan we're doing X, Y, and Z, what I'm going to do is change it up, and we're going to change a program on the fly. And I think we've lost that, and it's almost if you don't program by the numbers, you look down upon. Whereas I think it's far better to have that. Carl Vale talks about writing programs in wet cement rather than hard concrete, and I think that's really good. It is a process. It's definitely not a rigid prescription that we're looking for. Particularly in team sports. I think then what you're looking, going back to your question about do you just try and maintain, I can only speak from my experience in team sports. I haven't worked in rugby extensively, but we would certainly look to try and get a lot of work done in the off-season and pre-season and try and add the capacity to that squad, so that then when we get into the season, we can try and hold that within an acceptable level all the way through. And even at the lowest point, we're still working at good intensities. It's a bit like Sergei Bubka, who is training all the way through the year, regardless of what competition. He was always probably operating at 80%, and then when a big competition came in, he bumped it up to 90%, and then came back down to sort of 75, 80, and fluctuated through it. And I think that's what you're doing with team sports. You need to get your players to a fitness standard and try not to drop below that during the season, but then also have the ability to flex the program enough so that when big games come up, when big challenges, we're going into a winter period now at the club where we've got fixture congestion. So how do we cope with that? We manipulate our volumes and our intensities on the go based on what we're seeing coming through, depending on the opposition you're playing. So I think it has to be a lot more flexible now, Jamie, than it has in the past.
Yeah, definitely. I think you're right. I think you need to have a kind of a plan in place, but you need to have the ability to be flexible within that plan, don't you?
Yeah, and I think that's the bit that's lost. Everyone's got cracking spreadsheets with system mass volume loads and predicted 1RMs in 10 weeks' time, and I just don't think that's the reality. I don't think that's how you can program in modern sport. I think we have to become coaches again. We've become strength and conditioning scientists. I think we have to not forget we're coaches first and foremost.
Yeah, definitely. Great advice. So moving on, this is a listener's question, and it's kind of asking the best way to include strongman training as part of their program.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. I guess it would go back to those fundamental things that I believe in, that we talked at the start of the podcast. For me, it's got to add something to the program rather than just being done because everyone else is doing strongman. Strongman training is great for strongman athletes, just the same as Olympic lifting is great for Olympic lifters and powerlifting is great for powerlifting. There may be elements that you can take from each of those strands and apply them to the sport you're working in rugby. But I think if all of a sudden your training just looks like strongman, then you're going to create strong guys, but not necessarily great rugby players. So I think it's always having a training purpose in mind. So understanding, okay, what physical quality is it that I want to improve? And is strongman training the tool, or an element of strongman training the tool that is best going to improve that? If it is, go for it. But you do see it all too often, people adopting training methodologies that work for the sport itself, but not for the sport that you're competing in. It's a bit like, you could name a ton of them. Powerlifting, Olympic lifting, CrossFit, strongman. They're all fine as training methodologies, just not always great for improving sports performance.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I think it's like you say, whatever you do has to have a purpose, and maybe to help answer the listener's question, like in my opinion, you can kind of use strongman as part of a metabolic circuit or something like that. It might kind of bridge the gap between kind of the gym-based conditioning more so into rugby specific, for want of a better term.
Yeah.
And it's probably more applicable to the forwards, for instance.
Yeah.
But if you completely adopt strongman, completely in your program, you're not training for rugby, you're training for strongman. Like you said.
You have some great guys travelling up to Scotland and doing strongman competition.
Yeah.
I think as you alluded to there were probably points within the season where it's really beneficial. Absolutely, in pre-season, do you set out some strongman challenges and have competition amongst the lads and the girls that you're working with? Of course, I think that's a novel strategy. And as you said, in season, maybe when you're looking to switch it up a little bit and have more of a global metabolic stress on the system rather than a specific training adaptation, then some of those strongman events and training methodologies will be really applicable. So I can see it being used. I think people do sometimes just run away with it, and you've got a rugby team that just look like strongmen.
Yeah, And like you said as well, it's the same with any kind of training modality. So make sure you're using what you can from those training approaches to enhance your rugby performance, not just run away with it.
You know, I mean, calisthenics at the moment is big. Everyone's doing handstands and gymnastic stuff, and which is great, you know. But is being able to do a handstand going to improve you as a rugby, as a forward, or as a? I'm not convinced. So understand why you're doing it. If it's because it's a challenge and you want to learn how to do it, fine. But if you think it's going to cross over into performance, I'd question that.
Yeah. And now this is a question we ask all the guests on the podcast. What do you think is the biggest mistake rugby players make when it comes to strength and conditioning?
I feel bad because I've got limited experience working with pro rugby. So I've done some stuff with the women's game, with the national team, and I've worked with some individuals. So I guess my comments, I qualify all my comments by saying these are probably from an outside observer looking in on the sport. And so you can take with it as you like. I think what we probably saw was over a number of years, there was an emphasis across different nations of just getting freaking strong. And it was all about strength. It was all about more load. It was about the biggest dumbbells, which team's got the biggest set of dumbbells in you know, two people having to lift them on. And I think, again, we forgot about performance on the pitch. And, okay, strength is an underpinning physical quality, but you've got to be able to run, you've got to be able to change direction, you've got to be able to take collisions. So I think maybe that's an issue, and I think that probably filters down into the youth setup, where certainly you're seeing lots of younger developing rugby players that are kind of caught up in this whole sort of body image issue. And again, they're getting strong and they're getting hench, you know, and they're getting hashtag gains with a capital Z. But, you know, if you look at their physiques, aesthetically, they're probably looking pretty good. But is that going to set them up for long-term success in terms of their sports performance? And, you know, again, I'd question some of the training modalities some of the younger athletes are doing to try and, you know, get too big too quick, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, and you'll know as well as anyone that there's obviously diminishing returns with strength improvements to performance. So obviously it's important for them to have that, but not at the detriment of other parts of their performance, whether it's speed, agility, you know, technical, tactical.
Yeah, you know, I'm lucky. You know, one of the sports I consult in, as I said, is professional football. Now, the gains that we can get from strength with that group of athletes is huge, because they've just never really been exposed to an extended training history of proper strength training.
Yeah.
So we're seeing great improvements and great benefits from the work in the gym that's then transferring out onto the pitch. A sport like rugby that's probably traditionally embraced physical preparation, as you say, there's going to be diminishing gains just by getting bigger and stronger. And I think maybe you could look to some of the other sort of Southern Hemisphere teams where maybe some of the smaller, more mobile players come to the fore. Yeah,
definitely. Right, moving on, and I'm expecting a very good answer to this question, as you have published a book called You're Hired. What is your advice to an upcoming strength coach?
Read the book. No, in all seriousness, I mean that's why the book was put together. I kept getting emails and calls from aspiring S&C coaches. You know, what book should I read? What course should I go on? What should I do for a work experience? How should I get an internship? And there came a point I just thought, I'm telling the same people the same thing over and over again. So I put the book together. It's for charity. Donations go towards a cancer charity to support an intern that I worked with who sadly passed away from cancer, and it also goes to the UKSCA to support an up-and-coming S&C coach that's awarded to. So, you know, I make no money off the book, and within it, what I wrote was essentially how I got into S&C, because I figured if I can do it, anyone can. I'm not the sharpest tool in the box, you know, and if I can do it, then anyone can. And I offered all the mistakes that I made so that people can fast forward it. I think if you're going to look at stuff that you've got to do, you know, read You're Hired. The network, building a network is the key thing, and it won't always bring the rewards immediately. but you will find that 5, 10, 15 years down the line, someone that you've met at a conference, that you've kept in touch with, that you've gone and spent some time with at their club, will call you and will alert you to an opportunity or tell you about something that's going to be really useful for your practice. So building a network is super important. It was something that I was really poor at and that I've had to work at massively. And then the final thing, which, considering we're if we're talking to S&C coaches who love planning, they don't plan their own professional development. They kind of drift and then wonder why in 5 years' time they're still doing an internship or working at a club they don't want to be at. And in the book, I outline, I put together a professional development plan and some tasks that the guys who read it, the guys and girls who read it, can work through those tasks, and it helps pinpoint the areas in their career development where they're lacking, and then that gives them the focus. So the same way that you would plan a program to address the weak points with your athlete, you should be doing that with your own career development, because otherwise you'll de-skill, you'll de-train, and 5 years' time you'll have been taken over by other coaches out there. So yeah, them are 3 bits of advice. Hopefully it's good, Jamie.
and buy the book.
yeah, definitely. Look, absolutely buy the book. Like I say, it's 100% proceeds go to charity, and it's an easy read, and it's written in a very simple language. A little bit industrial at times, but it's the way I sort of communicate.
No, that's great. It's definitely for a great cause, and obviously be a great help for anyone looking to get their foot in the door with strength and conditioning.
Yeah.
And in terms of, professional development, that's something that, I must admit I kind of struggle to do. Working week in, week out in professional rugby, it's difficult to get to things.
Yeah.
And it's something I really got to work hard to increase those opportunities to do things like that.
Yeah, so my advice to you, Jamie, then would be one that I've got in the book, and it's that Kevin Costner Field of Dreams, build it and they will come. If you can't get out to things, try and manipulate ways of getting people to come to you. So we do that at West Brom. We get people in to us to spend time with us, and then that means that you don't have to leave your office, and you get the experts coming to see you. So there you go. Advice for you, Jamie.
Definitely, great. Now I'm conscious of time, Nick, so we'll just sort of crack on and find out where can people learn more about you and what have you got coming up.
So if you want to read my general musings and ramblings, www.nickgrantham.com. I only put stuff up there when I've got something interesting to say, so it's not like a blog piece every week. It comes and goes, but it's only when I think I've got something worth chatting about. If you want to follow us on Twitter, it's at Coach Nick G, and then all sorts coming up. But I guess the big thing for 2017 is the proper launch of the Professional Fitness Coaching Academy, which we've pulled together to bridge the gap between sort of PTs that have newly qualified, that then realise there's a little bit more to life than the 6-week course taught them, and actually want to put in place some solid working practices and develop as fitness professionals. So that's kicking off in February, and you can find out more about that at www.thepfca.com.
Cool. And of course we'll share all links to everything you've just mentioned in the show notes for people to check out. Brilliant. Thanks, Nick. It's been really insightful and great to speak to someone of your experience without making you sound old. So thanks very much and all the best.
Cheers, Jamie. Thanks for having me on.
So there you have it, some really good training advice and great advice for upcoming S&C coaches. Really recommend you go and buy You're Hired, even if it's just because it's for a great cause. But if you want to take your career to the next level in strength and conditioning, then it's definitely worth buying. Thank you again to Nick. Like I said, some great take-homes for the listeners. And of course, great to have a listener's question on there. So if anyone else has something they want answered on the podcast, whether it's from myself and Dan or our guests, then please get in touch with us, social media or email. And of course, check out rugbyrenegade.com. Always stuff happening there. Just released the Rugby Proof ebook, the Ultimate Injury Prevention Program for rugby. Check that out and stay injury free and dominating the opposition. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to the Rugby Renegade podcast. For more quality rugby strength and conditioning information, check us out at rugbyrenegade.com. Rugby Renegade, building machines.